Thank you. I'd like to start by thanking the Society of Friends. They are very generously allowing us to use this hall in this wonderful building, and I would like to recognize the lands upon which we stand and on which the building stands. The Huron-Wendat, the Petun, the Seneca, and above all our friends, the Mississauga of the Credit, have long lived on these lands and protected them. I'd like to begin by saying we're actually looking at two questions here, which are the simple questions. Egerton Ryerson has been accused of being, quote, the architect of the residential school system. So we'll be looking at that accusation to see if it is true or not, or justified or not. Henry Dundas, a Scottish politician of the late 18th and early 19th century, has been accused of delaying the end of slavery in the British Empire. So we'll be looking at whether that accusation is justified or not. Now, I'd like to introduce the first speaker, Lynn MacDonald. It's very difficult to summarize what she did and what she does. Lynn is Professor Emerita of Sociology at Guelph University. She is the editor of the 16, I think, volumes of the works of Florence Nightingale, the great reformer of health and welfare for people, a great statistician and nurse. And she has written many books, and she's a former member of Parliament, a leading campaigner against tobacco back in the day, and played a key role in ending the omnipresence of tobacco in our lives. And she is, of course, extremely interested in climate change and the defense of the environment. Lynn.
Thank you very much, Gilbert. I'm pleased to be with you here on this interesting subject of the parallels between these two people. And I'm going to start with Dundas to rename Dundas Street, You Must Demean, as happened with Ryerson at Ryerson University. They were both subjected to false accusations, lots of them, petitions, social media, and of course, the Ryerson, I'll be speaking on Ryerson in more detail later. We're going to start more with Dundas, but they went back and forth. One side, a move on one encouraged a move on the other. But without a shred of evidence for either, officials jumped on the bandwagon about the same time when these decisions were made. The Ryerson decision, of course, has gone through. The renaming has happened. The Dundas Street. So we see June and July 2021 were key periods for the decisions to be made. And I do ask the question, who put what in the water supply to Toronto, because City Hall and Ryerson University are pretty close together, and it's just absolutely bizarre the way things moved on. So we're going to start with the Dundas situation, statues and plaques. And this gets intertwined, Dundas Street here in Toronto, but a Dundas statue in Edinburgh, the Melville Monument, named after Henry Dundas, who became first Viscount Melville. A massive prominent statue to him in Edinburgh, and then there's a smaller one to his son, who was the second Viscount. Both have plaques on them. They started off with more like graffiti, and it's been stepped up. So here's this massive Melville statue in a prominent place in Edinburgh, the Scotsman who kept slavery going. And it's just, there it is, it's in the form of graffiti. Robert Dundas is described as the son of slaver. So he's being blamed for what his father did not do. It's that far out. Henry Dundas was in the slave business, a colonialist profiteer. Yet he was an effective abolitionist with 3 significant achievements in the abolition of slavery, and I'll go over them with you. But placed on the Edinburgh Monument, the Melville Monument in in Edinburgh. In 2020, this was dedicated to the memory of more than 500,000 Africans whose enslavement was a consequence of Henry Dundas's actions. This got voted on by the Edinburgh City Council and got placed on the actual statue. The writing comes from the first Scottish black professor to be knighted, Sir Geoff Palmer. Now, Sir Geoff Palmer, however, I point out, was an expert in botany, not in history. He defended and expanded the British Empire, imposing imperial rule on indigenous peoples, and curbed democratic dissent in Scotland, influence of the murder of George Lloyd. That's the background for the assault on him. Things moved along after that, but that was the first thing. And so these first moves were promoted by Black Lives Matter. Sir Tom Devine is a top historian, now retired, in Edinburgh, and I believe these words are bad history and in future years will come back to haunt the city. It was the city council who approved of them. I mean, it started off with graffiti, but then it's the city council who put them up. And you'll see similarities with Toronto, that there are historians who knew better, but they were simply ignored. And you have the non-experts, staffers and so forth, who are effectively making the decisions. The scapegoating of Henry Dundas is wrong. And said Sir Tom Devine, the gradual approach which he promoted would eventually have worked. But there were so many circumstances that would have made it impossible to move on quick abolition. And I think I can say a little bit more on that. The first achievement that Henry Dundas made is that he defended a runaway slave. Joseph Knight, he had been enslaved in Jamaica, and he was brought by his owner to Scotland. He escaped. He was caught. But in the lower court, he was actually freed. However, his owner appealed. So the case went to a higher court with 3 judges, and that's when Henry Dundas took it on pro bono, and he was successful with this with very significant results. He took the case, won the appeal, and the decision resulted in freeing all slaves in Scotland. So not just the one, it became general. Dundas's winning argument. In 1778, Dundas argued, "Human nature, my lords, spurns at the thought of slavery among any part of our species." And the court ruled, echoing his words, "The dominion assumed over this Negro under the law of Jamaica, being unjust, could not be supported in this country to any extent. No person should be a slave on Scottish soil." And that meant all slaves there, probably not a large number of them, but there were some, would be freed, and any who came, no one could bring slaves in. Any owner in another place could not bring them to Scotland. So that was a very significant move, and that was Dundas's first achievement as an abolitionist. Now, the gradualist argument is the one that got him into trouble in Scotland. As an MP, this is after this early achievement, Dundas moved an amendment to a motion of William Wilberforce to make emancipation gradually. Now, what happened was William Wilberforce, who had been very important in the abolition movement, was the parliamentary leader for some years. In 1791, he had introduced a motion into the House of Commons, and it was soundly defeated. So he brings one in the very next year. Dundas is there at that point, and he brings in an amendment to make it gradual emancipation. Well, that's what's gotten him into trouble in Edinburgh and Toronto. But there wasn't a hope of getting immediate emancipation to happen. It just wasn't going to. Wilberforce's first motion was defeated very badly. The second motion, with gradual in it, actually passed in the House of Commons, but not in the House of Lords. Well, if you know anything about parliamentary procedure, you know that to get a law passed, it has to be a bill, not merely a motion, and it's got to get passed in the House of Commons and the House of Lords, or for us in the Senate, and it has to be signed by the head of state. In that case, it was George III, who was pro-slavery. I mean, there wasn't a hope of getting an immediate abolition motion through. So here we are in what Dundas is actually facing. Now, Dundas's appointment in Ontario was very important. He became Home Secretary, and he appointed the first Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada then, John Graves Simcoe. Simcoe was an abolitionist, and he gets here, and one of the first things he wants to do is to get slavery abolished. Now, again, did we know how many slaves that there were slaves? William Jarvis actually was a slave owner. Now, before people run out and want to change the name of Jarvis Street, apparently it was named after a cousin of his who was a good guy, so let's not get too excited about this. Simcoe tried to get a law adopted, but there was too much opposition. The Attorney General, John White, was an abolitionist, and he got a bill into the House, but it was turned down. Jarvis, the provincial secretary, and his wife were both slave owners. I mean, slave owners, sitting in, they were MPPs, and they're slave owners. We just don't imagine those things, but that's what it actually was. So John White, the Attorney General, introduced a bill, didn't go anywhere, and so then he decided to amend it, and it was amended drastically. It was a very poor cousin of the one that was initially brought in. It would not free any slave right on the spot. It was very, very gradual. However, it got adopted, and it was the first legislation that was actually anti-slavery to be passed in the British Empire, even though it was only gradual, very, very gradual. And so this was the limitation of slavery, a bill that was passed in 1793. And so with this long waiting period, and if people want details, I can give it to you, but with this long waiting period, slaves did finally begin to get freed. But before it happened in the British Empire, the gradual act that got through did actually start to release people, and it was not till 1834 that the British Parliament had their act. It was adopted the year before, and it came into force August 1st, 1834. So there are parallels between Dundas and Ryerson. You get Dundas denounced for doing the opposite. He's an abolitionist with successes, and he gets denounced for prolonging slavery, for delaying abolition of the slave trade so that more people were brought to the West Indies and were made into slaves than if the slave trade had stopped promptly. Well, it just wasn't going to happen that way. Dundas was promoting abolition. Ryerson was promoting indigenous people. They're both siding with people who are now the opposition is that they harmed Ryerson, that he actually was instrumental in the design and implementation of the residential school system, which he did not, and Dundas for delaying the abolition of slavery and the slave trade, which he was not. So they're just absolutely extraordinary differences here in the perceptions and the reality for both of them. Ryerson. Well, red paint was put on the statue on his hands. This is a fine statue. I'll show you a nice picture of it later, that was raised by public subscription in his honor after he died. But the red blood was put on after the findings of unmarked graves at residential schools. The red blood, you would think that he had actually killed children. It's just really horrible, this depiction. Yet he was a supporter of Indigenous people. He supported their land claims. He was named a brother to the Ojibwe, the Mississaugas of the Credit, where he went as a missionary. And he was given an Indigenous name, Chihawk. How much was this even known at Ryerson University as it then was? Probably not at all. He was just smeared. And here is an interesting picture of the bottom of the of the Ryerson statue at the edge of the campus. And you can see there are children's shoes there. Children's shoes were used in demonstration at residential schools where the unmarked graves were found, and they were to represent the children who died there and who did not go back home. And so here people have brought in shoes in front of Ryerson's statue as if he had been running residential schools that killed children. He had nothing to do with them. And they didn't start till after he died. He supported the voluntary bilingual schools, day schools, that Indigenous parents and Indigenous leaders wanted. It's just way, way, way off the reality. And then can you see this go home? I've got a better picture of it here. Go home, go back where you came from. Well, guess where Ryerson came from? Ontario. He was born on a farm a little bit north of Lake Erie. His family were United Empire Loyalists. His father had fought with the British in the Revolutionary War in the US, and as we know, Britain lost, and people who sided with Britain were often given land in Canada, and so his father came up as a United Empire Loyalist, but Ryerson himself was born on a farm quite near Long Point, and just north of Lake Erie. Well, the demeaning of Ryerson, go back where you came from, just the shoes, they heighten the emotions. They just make him look like an evil person. Yet Ryerson is just completely the opposite, and it's well documented. He went as a missionary to the Mississaugas of the Credit at the Credit River. He supported their land claims. If they had been successful in getting them, there would be a large number of Indigenous people right in Toronto living on their own land. But it didn't work. But he was out there supporting them. And so here is the statue of Ryerson that was toppled after a Toronto rally, and the university announced that it would not be restored or replaced. The university did nothing to protect the statue. There was no security on it, no CCTV. Somebody was pursued about it, but charges were dropped. No one was ever appeared in court for the vandalism of that statue. Mohawk warriors claimed responsibility for them. Mohawks, well, Ryerson's particular connections were with the Ojibwe, not with the Mohawks, but the Mohawks of the Six Nations, they themselves came up from the U.S. as, you might say, like United Empire Loyalists. They had supported the British in the Revolutionary War, as Ryerson's father had, and they were given land near Brantford as a resort for doing that. Mohawks, as his own father, were United Empire Loyalists, and similar situation, but not understood at all. This is a photograph from Caledonia in Six Nations territory, and the statue has been taken there. Ryerson's particular connections were with the Ojibwe, but he knew Mohawks too, for certain, and was on good terms with them. Here's a photograph from the Caledonia demonstration, July 2021, and you can see you see the head. I mean, it's just an absolutely shameful portrayal. So who was he? Who was this person that all these horrible things came from? A major founder of public education in Canada, and basically this is still admitted, even at the old Ryerson University. Chief Superintendent of Education for Upper Canada, and it influenced the Western provinces. Now, it's hard for us to understand how backward education was. Few children went to school back in Ryerson's day, and there was no teacher training. Who knows how good the schools would have been if they did go. And it was Ryerson who got the first teachers' college called the Normal School started. Before that, there weren't any. And then he got grammar schools started, which were high schools, and free public libraries. I mean, he was very progressive. He believed that all children should get a decent education, not just those whose parents could pay for it. I mean, we take that for granted. I mean, people may want to send their children to a private school, and they can do that, but we take it for granted there will be decent public schools. not so then. That was revolutionary. So what he did, he was also the founding president of Victoria College. It was then in Cobourg. It's now part of the University of Toronto, and it moved from Cobourg to Toronto. And he taught moral philosophy there. But Victoria College in Toronto also attacked Ryerson. It's not as obvious as Ryerson University, because it's not the whole university that's named after him, but there was a Ryerson residence and there were Ryerson scholarships. Well, they were taken away at Victoria. And the recommendation to do that, not to mention the name of Ryerson in an honorific way, it was immediately adopted by the Board of Regents. They never sent it out for any kind of expert review. The same as at Ryerson University. They had a task force. The task force did abysmal work. It was never checked by experts. There wasn't one person on the task force who knew anything about Ryerson, and it just got pushed through. It was just in both places, just pushed through without question. Ryerson was also a journalist. He was the founding editor of the Christian Guardian, which was the Methodist magazine, and it was the highest circulation magazine in Upper Canada. It wasn't just a church magazine, it was a weekly, but it had international news, national news, science, arts, all kinds of things in it. It was a general magazine, and it was popular, it was good, it was well read, and Ryerson used it for a variety of causes, for his own progressive causes, and to cover missions by Indigenous people and for Indigenous people. He published many accounts by the various Methodist missionaries, and what people perhaps don't understand is that the Mississaugas of the Credit and other Indians converted, and many of them themselves became missionaries. And so it's not just white folks going out to missionize the Indians. They are Christians who are committed going out to convince other people who have not. It's an interesting situation. Ryerson, the missionary, he was a devout Christian, a Methodist minister, and a missionary. He worked on the Yonge Street circuit. And this, that is, he would be riding on horseback, composing a sermon on horseback, going to a variety of churches. They obviously didn't have enough ministers to cover them all. And so he did that, and he did it part-time when he was with the Mississaugas of the Credit. And when he moved there in 1826, he actually lived in a wigwam. They didn't have houses then; they were just beginning to get houses there. Living with the Mississaugas of the Credit, Ryerson loved the experience. He learned Ojibwe. How many settlers learned an Indigenous language? He did. He didn't learn it perfectly. He needed interpreters for something very important. And Kakawakwanabee, who was his closest Indigenous friend, that's his Indigenous name. Peter Jones, his father was a settler, so he had two names. Ryerson moved in with the family of the brother of Peter Jones, John Jones, and John Jones was actually married to a Mohawk wife. So he lived with them, and again, got to know them. And this is a picture of Kakawakwanabee in his finery. He traveled, raised funds for mission schools, and was an excellent leader, highly respected himself. And he was an elected chief, so he's a missionary. He's a convert to Christianity. He's a missionary, and he's trusted by other Indigenous people in his community to represent them. So he's an elected chief. You see, it's not as if it's the missionaries versus the people. They saw the connections, and Kakawakwanabee did important work in both connections. So here's Ryerson just after he's arrived at the Mississaugas of the Credit, September 16th. I have now arrived at my charge among the Indians. I feel an inexpressible joy in taking up my abode amongst them. He's recording this in his journal, which is quotations like this are easily available, in fact, online. The next day, this day I commenced my labors amongst my Indian brethren. My heart feels one with them. They seem to be alive to their eternal interests. He loves the experience there. However, very soon there is trouble with firewater, and we know that alcohol had been rejected traditionally by indigenous people. They had it and didn't want it and got rid of it, but obviously settlers brought it in. Sadly, a short time later, several of the men became intoxicated, and one shot himself, intoxicated because someone had laced the cider with whiskey and it was too strong, and Ryerson did the funeral. Economic development was needed. When Ryerson went there, the people had already converted. So he's there as a missionary, but there's nobody to convert. They've already converted. They needed pastoral care, and they needed help with economic development. They understood that they had to move on to farming. Their fishing grounds were crowded out by white people fishing the salmon there. Hard to imagine there was wonderful salmon in Lake Ontario, not too far from where we are right now, but there was, and overfishing and pollution. And he supported their land claims. He helped them with farming, to learn farming, how to make farms, and he had learned some carpentry so he could help with building. He had very practical skills that were needed because they understood they had to make that transition. They couldn't live by hunting and fishing as they had before. And Ryerson had those skills, and they were very useful on the job with the Mississaugas of the Credit. More from his journal. That we're moving on just a few months later. I have this week been trying to procure for the Indians the exclusive right of their salmon fishery, which he hopes will be granted by the Ontario legislature. It wasn't. The colonial office in the UK and officials in Canada wanted settlers. They wanted virtually the whole country, and indigenous communities kept getting moved further and further away and to smaller and smaller places. He supported their efforts unsuccessfully to get land, and they later moved to the Six Nations. They were right in Toronto at the mouth of the Credit, and they moved some distance away to Brantford because they didn't have enough to live on, but that was somewhat later. Ryerson did what he could. He was helping them, and it simply was not successful. The false attacks. Social media and blogs began to blame Ryerson for the Canadian residential school system, accusations that were not countered at the then Ryerson University. The administration went along with them, so you had these appalling accusations floating around, petitions, etc., and the university administration said nothing. This is appalling. I'm a retired professor. I think it's appalling that there should be so much false information in circulation and no responsible person says anything about it. Accusing organizations are actually subsidized by the university. The Yellowhead Institute, the Aboriginal Students Education Council. There was a big petition for X University. We'll call it X University until they change the name. Thousands of people signed that. And this was never answered. It was called X University to get rid of Ryerson. And yet he was on the side of Indigenous people. It's just absolutely so wrong. The attacks get worse. In 2017, the Ryerson University Students' Council, they demanded the name change and removal of the statue. 2018, a community consultation report was released. And guess who headed it up? Well, the Equity Vice President. Equity, be worried when you see the word equity. They can be thugs like nobody else because they don't have to have any expertise. They're in favor of equity. That seems to excuse everything. And then July 2018, the unveiling of a plaque. And this upped the accusation the accusation against Ryerson then was that he was instrumental in the design and implementation of the Indian residential school system. Only a year before they had acknowledged, well, he didn't start it, but his ideas influenced it. It was unveiled by the university president, Dr. Lackamy, with the social work student, Sarah Dennis. Prayers were said by the Indigenous elder, Joanne Dallaire. She had been co-chair of the consultation report that was so negative about Ryerson. And then she was put on as co-chair of the actual task force that came up with the recommendation to get rid of the name. So here she is. She gets put on a task force, but her mind is certainly already made up. Thousands passed by the plaque, 2018 to 2021. It was up for 3 years. Thousands of people passed it, some every day. And they saw this information, this horrible accusation, and students told the task force that they were hurt, that they were wounded by it. And I've got one of these blurbs that got reported in the task force report. Well, here is the plaque, the unveiling of the plaque, and here are the words on the plaque. They were subjected, as well as being responsible for unspeakable abuse, neglect, medical experimentation, punishment for their cultures, loss of languages, and death. The aim of the residential school system was cultural genocide. Ryerson was not involved. He died before they were started, and what he advocated was very, very different, as I've mentioned before, and which you perhaps well know. The Standing Strong task force with an Indigenous elder as co-chair and a history professor, actually a history professor, some with a PhD in history, but not Canadian history, and not with any knowledge of Ryerson, Catherine Ellis. Not one person on that task force was an expert on Ryerson. Now, we do know that favorable briefs on Ryerson were sent in. In fact, I have one sent in by a Dr. Nathwani at the University of Waterloo, a fellow P.Eng. Dr. Lakmi was a PhD P.Eng. Himself. And it was David Crombie who sent me the brief. They were there. David Crombie was had previously taught at Ryerson when it was an Institute of Technology, and he was the first chancellor. He was pro-Ryerson, but his words were ignored as well. So here's the task force. It was committed to a thorough, open, and transparent process. Well, it wasn't in reality. The Ryerson material, favorable Ryerson material, appeared in Appendix D. It's quite lengthy, and it says all kinds of good things about him there, but none of it was used for the recommendations. They were simply ignored when it gets serious. The anti-Ryerson statements by anonymous community members were featured in the report. And here they are. If you can see it, you could just see. These are anonymous statements. We don't know who said them, and they are the ones that are featured. There are 10 of them throughout the report, and they're stuck close to the area where the recommendations come, as if this is what is influencing them. As I say, the positive things that came in on Ryerson, and they did exist, but they were simply ignored. And here's another one. So, and featured, they stand out bright and clear in the report. That was Appendix D. Now here's Appendix B, what we learned. And this one is really quite shocking. The task force report included a long list of organizations, a few were individuals, but mostly organizations, that it implied provided information, what we learned, like we learned something, and they give this long list, 109 names, including the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, LEAF, unions, all kinds of organizations of that. I tried to get the briefs after the report went through and the name change was announced. I tried to get them, wanting to see, how did this all happen? I haven't seen them yet. I've only seen a few that people sent me that I managed to get from them. And people I contacted, like the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, they said they hadn't sent in a brief. So here we have something very sneaky going on. The task force saying that they learned these things from these, some of them are quite prominent organizations. There were Black organizations, Indigenous organizations, all kinds of organizations that are listed amongst these 109. But I've not managed to get them, and put in access to information. Gilbert Reed helped on this, and it came back with 109 lines, like pages of it, pages. And each one says, that no information supplied because of privacy and the financial situation of the university. One of the what we learned is lists the Ryerson's family, like the Ryerson family don't want their views known. I mean, this is just absolute nonsense, and in effect, this is censorship. I was told that the briefs would become available in the university archives, redacted for the names of all the organizations and individuals. Well, can you imagine the Canadian Civil Liberties Association sends in a brief and they want it redacted, they want it to have a secret brief? I mean, this is just nuts. OPSU, CUPE, I mean, these are well-known unions. They have staff. They do research and do briefs. It's just, this is just appalling. And they said there were 109 of them, but 26 of them were duplicates. I mean, the idea that they reviewed them and considered whether it would be safe to provide the information. Well, this is just totally phony. I mean, they didn't even, they made up these names. Well, they got the names, but whether or not how many of them actually sent a brief in, I still don't know, apart from the very small number that I managed to reach myself. Well, those are the sad facts of the situation. And where are we now? The name change has gone through. We're not going to change it. On Dundas, I hope that we are going to stop the renaming of Dundas Street, and other people will be addressing that this evening. But the name change has gone through. It's now got that boring name, Toronto Metropolitan University, and that's what it is. But we want to see Ryerson honored there and throughout Toronto. People deserve to have correct information. It's scandalous that university students should have all this bullshit circulate and they don't get actual evidence. And we'd like to be on a website. I think it would be good to have a building named after Ryerson at Toronto Metropolitan University. There's an enormous building with 4 wings named after Howard Kerr, the first president, and he's the one who wanted the name Ryerson there because he had so much respect for him. It will take time for that kind of thing to happen. People will have to find out that Ryerson was an honorable person. He made an enormous contribution to Ontario and Canada, and he didn't do the things that he's accused of. The province of Ontario should honor him. In time, his statue should be on the grounds of Queen's Park. Well, you see, Sir John A. Macdonald has a statue there, and it's boarded up right now, so there's no point in proceeding on that one right now. But we would like to see that statue was raised in his honor after his death by public subscription of people who wanted to honor him. And portraits should go back up. There was a portrait of him in the halls of Queen's Park at the legislature. It was taken down, and it should go back up. And would like to see see him given the recognition that he really deserves. Victoria University should repair the damage there. They should rename those scholarships. His founding role should be acknowledged somewhere in the city, a major building. I would like to see the Toronto Reference Library named the Ryerson Reference Library. Ryerson was really the founder or main instigator. When I say the founder, he was a civil servant. It's not as if he could actually do it on his own, but his recommendations got through. He was really the person most significant in getting free public libraries for us. And the Toronto Reference Library it's a wonderful building, and it's an excellent library, and I'd like to see it named after him. The Toronto Reference Library is actually the highest circulation public library, I believe, in the world. It doesn't have the most books, like the New York Public Library, and perhaps a number of others have more books, but on a per capita basis, it's very well used. Well, this was part of Ryerson's belief that children should learn to read, all should learn to read, all should, and they should be able to carry on. Having gotten that education, they should be able to carry on by having access to free books. Well, this is the statue, before it was wrecked. It's stored away somewhere. Whether it's got the head or not on it, I don't know. But this is the Ryerson we would like to be restoring in terms of his honor. And I'll leave you with this picture. This is a fine portrait of him. Portraits aren't up. You won't find them in the halls of public buildings now, but it's a fine portrait. He was highly respected in his time, and I think we should restore his honor. And I invite you to think about that. We'll be having, we're going to move to questions and answers now, but we'll have an opportunity with a couple of other speakers about, what do we do next. So anyways, thank you, and open to you for questions.
Any questions? Sure.
Hi. How do you explain the behavior of the senior administration, both at Ryerson and at Victoria College? I mean, what were they thinking?
Yeah, I can't answer the question. It's just so puzzling to think how it happened. It would appear that Dr. Lacamy, I've never met the man, that he was hesitant at first when it was raised. And then but he very quickly jumped on the bandwagon. But he didn't initiate it. But why? Like the Yellowhead Institute was one of the groups that did at Ryerson, the then Ryerson. Yellowhead Institute was named after Chief Yellowhead, who was a Methodist convert and someone Ryerson knew. I mean, it's just absolutely bizarre that this opposition should come from from an institute named after somebody who would have been positive. It's just inexplicable. Okay, so you have the Dundas stuff, the murder of George Floyd. You have the discovery. I would say for the Ryerson, that would be key for Dundas. But for Ryerson, I would say the discovery of the unmarked graves were really the turning point. That where people saw that children actually died. Well, of course they're going to be. They weren't unmarked at the time, but like a century or so later, they had, I think they had wooden crosses or something. So they'd be unmarked then. But any institution is going to have deaths at it. Whether they're excessive or not, it's a question you have to find out how many years and how many children and how many people were at it. Florence Nightingale, the first I got onto this is Florence Nightingale did the first quantitative research on disease and death rates at colonial schools, which included day and residential, and in other countries, in Africa, Australia, and Ontario. And she found out that overall they were about twice what they were for English children living at home. But that would be true if they went to Eton or Harrow. There would be higher rates because because institutions, there's crowding, infectious diseases spread, and so on. But in Ontario, it wasn't twice as many. It was about 1.5 times as many. It was like 0.9 something and 1.2 or something like that per thousand. So so that this was known. There shouldn't have been any surprise that this happened. How bad it is really depends. You'd have to do a lot of research to find out how bad it was. How many children were there? Because just the sheer numbers don't say anything. And of course, we don't know how many graves there actually are. These are tests. So, but there's no doubt that the residential schools were to assimilate people. There's no doubt that the loss of language and culture were deliberate. There's no doubt about that. But I just can't believe that anyone wanted children to die there. That the object was assimilation, not annihilation. And the death rates were higher than they should be, but they were not enormous. A cultural genocide, yes. To make this into genocide, as has been said, does seem to be running too far with it.
Another question?
There's a question online. Okay, sorry. Okay, I think that person's on. Okay.
Did you say you had a question?
There's somebody online who wants to ask a question. I think it's called Paul.
So can you read it out for us?
I,
Is it my turn, or?
yeah, there's another question on Zoom, so he's talking on Zoom. Oh, please ask the
Would you
question.
like me to, are you waiting for me to ask a question?
Oh, yes, please, yes.
Okay, I have two questions. Lynn, thank you for your presentation. I was pleased to hear it tonight. Murray Sinclair spoke at Ryerson in 2016. There's quite an interesting video of his presentation, which I watched with great interest. And he was asked questions, and from what I saw, he wasn't actually discussing anything to do with replacing Ryerson. In fact, I thought he was fairly conciliatory in his presentation. So my first question is this far beyond what Justice Murray Sinclair, chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, envisioned would happen? That's number one. And number two, you referenced 2 or 3 of the scholars at Ryerson. One of them would be Patrice Dutille, and the other would be, of course, Ron Stagg. Could you tell us a little bit more about how they were marginalized and eliminated? Because are they not the experts in the field?
Okay, well, let's start with the second one. Ron Stagg does know a lot, and so does Patrice. They spoke to the task force, or at least Ron Stagg did. I don't know if Patrice did it verbally or sent something in, but obviously those positive remarks got just were dropped. I mean, they didn't go anywhere. And then they published that very, well, they published an article, The Imbecile Attack on Egerton Ryerson, in the Dorchester Review, in which they lay things out. And of course, that went nowhere. It got steamrollered through. Don't ask me how, but what happens, there are witch hunts, there are pogroms, there are things that people just take something up and go with it. So that there were a small number of people at Ryerson who were pro Ryerson, as David Crombie was. And students, we have one student member of Friends of Egerton Ryerson, and she actually left when the name change went through. But she's just said it was you couldn't be pro Ryerson. I mean, you got shunned if you were pro Ryerson in the mood at that time. So what was your first question was about the, say that.
I watched Justice,
Murray Sinclair.
Justice Murray Sinclair's presentation, which is on YouTube.
Okay, well.
And I think they cut the questions off, though. I think I missed the tail end of it, because I was very interested in what he actually said to the students.
Yeah.
And I've heard, by the way, this is a bit of a dialogue, I hope. Let me just say that I had an occasion to listen to him, and I talked to him afterwards. And to be honest, I don't think he's as adamant about this as a lot of the people that have taken up the cause. In fact, I thought he was fairly reasonable about how far we should take this.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I didn't see the whole YouTube, but I did see an account of it, and he was not negative, I agree, and he did not accuse Ryerson of starting the residential school system, nothing of the sort. And there's nothing blaming Ryerson in the report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So, and he gave that talk, and you're right, it was nothing to implicate Ryerson. Now, he did give an interview to a Toronto Star reporter that got published, and he's very negative there. I followed it up. I sent him emails. I sent him 2 emails asking for what his evidence was, that Ryerson had done the things that he said. He called Ryerson a racist. And I asked what the evidence was. I got no reply. I finally sent him a paper letter to his office in Winnipeg, and a secretary sent a reply back saying that the Honourable Mr. Sinclair was too busy to reply to letters. So that was a negative thing. But you see, that came later. I would say probably he got swept up in the accusations later, but not from going over the evidence, because there isn't any evidence to show it. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission they were demonstrating residential schools. Ryerson's not there. I mean, there are a number of books on residential schools. You can look at them, which I have done. And Ryerson's name isn't in the index, because he had nothing to do with them. And there's a 2-volume Life and Letters and 3 regular biographies on Ryerson, and The Story of My Life, which is a memoir. Again, you can go through them. They do not mention the word residential school. He never talked about them. He never advocated them. It's not as if, well, it's a little bit dicey and we have to, look at the details. It's just not there. So it's just absurd as to how far it could go. But you're quite right. Murray Sinclair was not anti-Ryerson, and he only said that one thing later, probably caught up by the negatives.
Are there other questions? There's a question here in the House.
You just said that Murray Sinclair did not speak up on behalf of Ryerson. Were there any Indigenous leaders who did?
We met a couple at the Six Nations. We did meet.
No credit.
Yes. Now, let me see. There were 2. I can't remember their names right now, but we did meet 2. However, I think the brief that went in from the Six Nations by their chief was negative. I contacted him and asked for a copy, and I didn't get one. So my guess is that there was one Indigenous student, former a photojournalism student, Len Fortune, who sent in an excellent brief, a very pro-Ryerson brief. And again, it's one, like Ron Stagg and Patrice Dutil. The positive things about Ryerson were simply ignored. I don't know how many. It would be, if we had access to the briefs, it would be possible to find out, because some of the organizations mentioned actually are Indigenous organizations, but given the censorship that now reigns at Toronto Metropolitan University, we don't know what they said.
Lynn, can I comment on our visit to the Mississaugas? We went down, I tried to get a meeting with the chief, Stacy Laforme, who had given a brief, but we were put off to Daryl Wybenga, who's in charge of traditional, sorry, I've lost the title, traditional language, and his boss, Mark Wybenga, and his boss was Daryl Wybenga and Mark Laforme. And both of them were very interested in our meeting. They did agree that Chief Laforme had been kind of out of place in his presentation at Ryerson, and in fact they said they had sat down with Chief Laforme and kind of corrected him and indicated that Ryerson was not the person that he was indicated, and that in fact he had been a great friend of the Mississaugas.
Which is perhaps why he didn't want to send me his brief. Possibly they convinced him.
Any online questions?
Nobody raised their hand.
Nobody's raising their
Okay,
hand.
okay.
Any in-house questions? No, I guess we move on.
Okay, we move on.
Thank you, Lynn. That
Yep,
was wonderful.
yep, good.
So, I have 2 victims now. Caroline, you kind of escaped. You're supposed to be up here. And, yes, Bruce, you're supposed to be here too. So you move over to center stage.
May I stand?
I think you can. I don't know. That depends on camera. And yes, you can.
Yep.
So I will introduce Bruce first, and it'll be very brief. Bruce worked at Indian and Northern Affairs, and he moved on to urban planning, which he found dealt entirely with cement and steel and stuff like that, and he didn't like it, so he decided he would experiment with the front line in human relations, which is nursing, and that became his vocation, and in some ways he still does it today. Caroline is also a nurse, and she has spent many years in palliative care, among other things, and she has been a representative, a union representative for the nurses, protecting the nurses' vocation and their interests, which is a difficult thing, as we know. And she is active in the Friends of, I guess, both Dundas and Egerton Ryerson. So I think you can decide which one of you wishes to speak first.
Okay, 7 minutes. Who's marking? Yes, I know as Bruce the nurse on Toronto Island. But I first met Lynn MacDonald in 1999 when she addressed our Quo Vadis Nursing School alumni, and she was just setting out on her project to compile as much of the writings of Florence Nightingale as she could, which ended up being 17 volumes of something like 10,000 pages. And I'm guessing perhaps that it was Nightingale who kind of introduced you to the Indian residential school problem, because she had noted as early as the 1850s the death rates in the colonial indigenous schools were 4 times that of the English school kid. So I think it's natural that Lynn's interest peaked very suddenly when Ryerson was said to be identified with the Indian residential schools. And she quickly pointed out that this certainly was not so. And then, of course, on to Henry Dundas. I like Lynn exactly as she points out. It's quite fascinating. The number of our heroes, our historical heroes, were accused of doing exactly the opposite of what they in fact were doing. Certainly with Florence Nightingale in the mid-1850s, in an era when well-to-do women were not expected to do anything, or rather perhaps not permitted to do anything. And Nightingale, in fact, achieved so much, so incredibly much in that period, with her founding of professional nursing, the establishment of the schools and the curriculum, her heroism in the Crimean War, the planning of hospitals, the defining of public health, the introducing of the idea of free health care in the workhouses of London, her proficiency in statistics and using them in the promotion of public health. Egerton Ryerson, accused of initiating the hated Indian residential school, when in fact he was a great friend of the Mississaugas, of the credit. He was in charge of public schools of Upper Canada, not the Indian schools, which were the responsibility of the colonial office. And his only his only place there, when he was asked, because he knew the Mississaugas so well, knew their language, had lived with them, and he was asked his advice, and he sent them a letter and saying, yes, they should have the agricultural schools that the chiefs had requested. Henry Dundas, accused of being pro-slavery, when everything we read now indicates that he was truly an abolitionist. Yes, of course, they all grew up in Britain's colonial era, but then all of these people had done so much to, in fact, break those particular traditions. Where are we? But then, I'm somehow I got labeled to speak on action, and I'm afraid I'm not a strategist. But there were, in fact, some major breakthroughs in just the last 3 weeks. I trust most of you had seen the front page of the National Post, and with Dundas, the abolitionist should not be cancelled. And the reporter, of course, was the previous spoken of Patrice Dutil, who was a graduate of Ryerson. But Patrice certainly does a good job. And the comment, the city of Toronto needs to get history right. On the same day, that is February the 3rd, although it wasn't in the printed edition, in the online copy, of course, was Lynn MacDonald, Toronto should reverse its botched decision to rename Dundas Street. And then again, we've just been made aware of the publication just a week ago by John Best in the Bay Observer, that's Hamilton, I trust, with the opinion Dundas Street renaming turning into an embarrassment. And who has read the article by John Best, Opinion Dundas Street? This was a week ago. It's a very instructive article. Toronto City Council needs to save itself from embarrassment and scrap the whole idea of renaming Dundas Street. The decision was based on discredited research and biased handling of the issue from the beginning by city staff with an activist agenda. Specific council direction on public consultation was ignored, and key parts of the project were assigned to an underqualified consultant who openly admitted her bias on social media. The decision to rename Dundas Street was made in the immediate aftermath of the George Floyd murder. The idea of renaming arose in the aftermath of the murder in May of 2020. The slaying triggered a wave of demonstrations, as we're aware, across North America and Europe, and in Ontario, it was no different. Amidst the many anti-racism protests that were taking place in Ontario, cities during that period of unrest, Toronto City Council received a petition calling for the renaming of Dundas Street on the grounds that Henry Dundas, a prominent Scottish politician, was accused of prolonging the slave trade in the British Empire. This despite the fact that Dundas was on record as opposing the slave trade, never owned slaves, and as a lawyer had actually secured the freedom of the slave. This had occurred, it started in Edinburgh with the reclacking of the statue, and that was, the events in Scotland spread to Toronto. Also in the aftermath of Floyd's slaying was a movement in Edinburgh, Scotland to place a plaque on the statue of Dundas, blaming him for prolonging the slave trade. Leading the academics who provided research into the plaque was Stephen Mullen, whose opinion was largely relied upon by Edinburgh Council in the blacking decision. Almost immediately, Mullen's work was attacked by several academic experts. The journal Scottish Affairs published an expose that identified critical errors in Dr. Mullen's research and even called the integrity of his published work into question. Professor Angela McCarthy said Dr. Mullen had twisted the words of other scholars to support his thesis and failed to address the enormous obstacles to abolition. She stated, historians have the right to interpret facts differently, but not to knowingly misrepresent them. Dr. Mullen also posted a tweet accusing Jennifer Dundas, an Alberta Crown attorney and descendant of Henry Dundas, of leading a sinister misinformation campaign for her efforts to correct the record on the Dundas legacy. He later issued a statement in which read, "I now accept that this implication is without foundation, and I apologize unreservedly to Ms. Dundas." A similar apology was demanded and received from the City of Toronto staffer Richard Gerard, who prepared the historical research for the staff working group on Dundas Street renaming project, who had retweeted Mullen's comments about Ms. Dundas. But the Toronto staff had relied on Mullen's contested research. The public consultation did not follow the council's advice, the council's direction. For all the dozens of consultants who work in the field of either equity, diversity, and inclusion, or public consultation in Toronto and the GTA, the task force sole-sourced a contract to advise on the community consultation to a small Ottawa consultancy called Quake Lab. The agency's principal, Sharon Nyang Wessel, once said in a Woman of Influence profile, "We are not accountable to our clients, but to the BIPOC, disabled, LGBTQS women, men, and youth who we work in service of. Those folks, they're my bosses." In setting terms of reference for the contract, Blackman, this is Cheryl Blackman, who's head of museums, museums anyhow, provided a memo to the consultant that declared Dundas's role in prolonging the slave trade as established fact, despite the very active academic debate to the contrary. Quake Lab, as an EDI workshop provider had no demonstrated qualifications in conducting public consultations. It didn't matter, as it turned out, because Nain Wasso had no intention of consulting broadly, as council had stipulated. Instead, she recommended that engagement replace consultation. In other words, recommending that the city first make the decision to rename Dundas Street and then engage the public. Her reasoning might be explained by a tweet she posted after reacting to a poll that found the majority of Canadians were opposed to cancelling Canada, in which she wrote, "This is why I believe certain things don't need to be polls or surveys. You're replacing an unaffected majority's feelings over a marginalized minority's well-being." There's some thought to that. Toronto Council's direction in the Dundas Street naming issue was clear. They called for a 7-item public consultation program that consisted of speakers panel, town hall events, stakeholders meetings, First Nations consultation, a projected web page with an online survey, and a dedicated email and phone line for public comments. It also called for the public opinion poll instead. Staff only went ahead with meetings with stakeholders and the phone and email line. Instead of the broad community consultation that had been directed, Quake Lab held a total of 4 discovery sessions between December 2020 and February 2021, involving a total of approximately 25 members of the Black and Indigenous business communities. That was it. Toronto City Council received the report recommending the renaming of the street on June the 28th, 2021, just ahead of the July long weekend and what are typically the busiest meetings of the year for council. The name change was approved without council having a clear understanding of the degree to which public consultation they had approved had been shared. One more minute. Next steps. I don't know whether this is electioneering. Councillor Matt Lowe is to be commended for recently expressing willingness to revisit the issue and for acknowledging that the original decision was made in haste and without proper public consultation. He voted for the name change originally, and the easy way out would be to stick with the original decision. Hopefully a majority of his colleagues will reconsider, as well as ex-Mayor John Tory, who recently suggested in a television interview that we need to make sure we don't miss part of the history and have to go down this road again when asked about the Dundas renaming. Toronto Council's supposed to take up the issue sometime this year. Hopefully John Tory's unexpected departure won't get in the way of this matter getting a fresh look. That was a very instructive article, and it was certainly answered. Lynn and I visited the head of Fort York Museum and the head of Campbell House, and who clearly said if we were to hold this meeting there, we would be racist. I didn't catch it quite as quickly. Lynn caught it very quickly, and departed the
Well,
meeting.
they wouldn't let us have the meeting because they said the policy was not to have racist meetings.
Yes, exactly. I had a little bit of sympathy. I stayed on and I heard Liz Driver out, and I realized the tightrope that she is walking with the administration of the museums, the history museums. The second thing was that was January the 4th, and she had talked about being involved in major work. It turned out she was the leader of the demonstration attempting to stop the trees from coming down at Osgood Hall, which was a little interesting because the next proposed site was her own Campbell House, which was agreed would have to be demolished. And one of the comments was, well, it's been moved before, so it could be moved again, which wasn't exactly realistic. But it does make clear what's going on in the administration. What are we going to do about action? I don't know. First of all, it has been strongly suggested that please get your notes off to your councillor and to the new mayor-elect. Lynn has provided, actually pass a few of these around, please. Lynn has suggested this easy process. I think it's got to start there with these simple little things. I'm very pleased that we have, how many? Do we have 5,000 on Zoom at this meeting, Austin? And I think our next move I would like to consider is getting on to Montgomery Inn and Lambeth House. And I don't know where they stand, but it's very interesting to know that they both have done that. They're both on Dundas. They have the Dundas interest and a clearly a true historical interest. Sorry, I went over my 7 minutes.
Thank you very much. Now,
Oh, Lynn, did you want to say something? Hi, I'm Carolyn, and I actually am going to be fairly brief, but I do have a passion. I've been with the Friends of Egerton Ryerson for over a year, and my claim to fame this evening is I live and a walk 2 minutes off Dundas Street. So what I propose to do, and I have started doing it, is I have a bit of information, and I have, it's not a blue book, but it's a pink book, and I'm going from business to business, and I fold it this way, and I introduce myself, and I say, you know, I live around the corner, and I start talking, so then they start talking if it will work, because I want to engage with them, and I'm looking for things in the businesses that I'm going to see, is what do they think is happening? This is and Jan has a flyer as well, and she sent some out. But I'm looking at them as a neighbor, and I want to share my thoughts, and I'm very passionate about this. So I fold it like that, and I have it near them, and I watch to see what their eyes are doing with this, and I don't want them to take it too far away from their hands. And then I share the information that I feel that is relevant. One of the comments I had, and I met this lady, now she opens her coffee shop at 7 o'clock, and she makes great latte, and she said, why are they wasting all this money? And she wasn't 100% in agreement with Dundas, but she said, why would they waste millions of dollars when they can put the money into housing and into food banks and so forth? So I got that from her, and I said yes, and I did give a very simple line that, please look at this because, the issue that Dundas really was not as described, and so forth. But she came by herself with this, and really was very, very impassionate, said, I'm going to take your little flyer, and I'm going to put it on my board. And she was part of a community. And what I'm experiencing, which I wasn't expecting to experience, is I have lived in this community, which is raunchy to begin with, around Dundas and Sherburne. And I usually go along, because I walk by, and I still call it Ryerson, along Gerrard, but I also do walk along Dundas, and I'm finding all these interesting places. And some of people have the most, crazy comments, but this is part of a community, and this is why I'm getting very excited about it, and finding that I want to, like Lynn did for Ryerson, a fact sheet to go along with this. So it's like, did you know? So I may lean and check in with Janice and get a little bit more information, because what I'm finding, if I take a smaller range along Dundas and I start, I'm Sherburne, but I'm moving along towards Yonge Street, is repeat visits and really engaging in them. And of course then it is, which I adjusted this little flyer to put in Mayor Tory's, it's not Mayor Tory, Mayor of Toronto's email address, so it's generic, and to get them to write in and to, especially on the 2 points. One, do they understand what's happening? And most of them don't. They don't really know what it is. Some do, but if they do, then would they be prepared because of the concern for the community that they live in, that there are poor people? Up the street is Allen Gardens, and there are something like 45 tents, and that is, I'm 2 minutes one way and I'm 1 minute to Allen Gardens. So I do live in what's called a really interesting area. And I haven't frequented them yet, but they're not on Dundas Street. But I think that a lot of them have been there a while, and some of them they really have opinions that I'm just really starting. And this is why I'm saying I'm putting it all in my book. I ask, for the manager, I ask for their name, and I write everything down. And I had one stay, and it was a burger place, and it used to be a raunchy tavern. And she said to me, I can't divulge who the manager is. That's confidential information. And I said, I must write that down as an anecdote, because people will say the funniest things. And that's what I love about it, is this is a community. And I try to make them realize I'm sincere, that I live up the street on Pembroke, that I really am wanting to have a buy-in with this with them, that they have an influence. They could have a vote. They could write into the mayor. They could influence the decision that has not yet been truly made. I say truly made. So I don't know that I'm quite at, Gord, am I at 5 minutes?
Just about.
Okay. I think I've said most. I am following with what Bruce said about Montgomery Inn. I'm also found out, I didn't even realize how far Dundas Street went past Mississauga and onward, and they chose not to. And I thought to myself, this is my way of what I can do and spend time on the street and in the community and get them to react. What I want them to do is react. And especially, it may be an easier, because the information, they may look at it, and I watch what they do. As I'm going out the door, I watch where they put it, and the flyer, because I want to make sure that they haven't. One of them I saw, she went to the counter by her cash machine, and she was reading it, and I thought, well, there's a win-win. But I'm just saying, I'm just aware of the dynamics of it as I move forward to try to, in a small way, maybe make a change, and who knows what will happen. I mean, today wasn't the great weather. I kind of begged off. But that's sort of my as I said, my claim to fame, and I look forward to making maybe a small dent in the endeavor to try to put a stop to the changing Dundas Street. And it's my street. They can't do that to my street.
Caroline? If I were selling something, I'd want you to sell it for me. I'd like to present Gordon Walker now. All of this is about history to a certain extent. And, Gordon, I think you have set up a new institute to concentrate on historical studies, which is extraordinarily interesting. Gordon has been a minister in almost all the important ministries in the government of Ontario over the years. He was on the International Joint Commission between the United States and Canada establishing the water frontier and rights and responsibilities between the two nations, an absolutely crucial thing, which I probably explained badly. And he's extremely interested, I think, not only in history, but also in environmental and climate issues. Gordon.
Thank you. Well, I suppose I should position myself because I gather there's a larger audience somewhere in the atmosphere here. So I should, if I stand here, is that
Just take the podium.
stand there? All right. I've been
Just point to the computer. So
properly positioned for all I should do. So, well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, online and here in this very interesting Friends room. It's very interesting to be a part of your discussion. I must say that, Lynn, I keep thinking I'm doing catch-up as I come here and I find out what's happening, really. Maybe to some extent what we're talking about, you've been talking about for a long time. And I guess our real point is we're interested in history, and we're very annoyed that history is being rewritten. You can't rewrite history. Wasn't it Churchill who said that those who ignore history are bound to repeat it? Well, I think it's very much the case that if we go and rewrite our history, we will not obviously have history. It won't be history. And we've seen this in examples involving the movies, involving Netflix and The Crown and all these other things where they basically try and rewrite the history. That's so wrong. Well, a number of us were chatting last fall and we were quite concerned. And who were the number of us? Well, it turned out we were a bunch of old politicians, I guess. I think I was around 30 or 40 years ago when I had some active life in politics. Gordon McNulty was back there at that same time, and so I can't say he's that old, but you know, maybe it's added up with him a year at a time as well. But a number of us were wringing our hands and saying, what can we do? And maybe it was because we thought we were history ourselves. It was so long ago. So whatever the case was, we said, we don't like what's going on. What don't we like? Well, we don't like what's going on in the question of rewriting the history. That's very annoying when false facts are put forward. And tonight we've heard story after story after story of the false facts that have been presented to governments, to authorities, to governing authorities. And these organizations have done something that is terrible. And we hear about that with, of course, Egerton Ryerson. We hear about it, as we've heard it tonight again, about Dundas. Well, we can start to add in other people. MacDonald, John A. MacDonald. That's if we took our big three right now, we would name Ryerson and MacDonald and Dundas as big three issues. But there are more to come. We heard of Jarvis tonight. There are more people out there who have important historical commemoratives that were put there for a reason. And the reason was they did something very important in our history. Thinking of MacDonald, thinking of the two people we've heard compared about tonight, but thinking of others, whoever it might be. Well, you can always find something to say about them, even if we take the famous five. If we take any of the people who have stood in commemorative positions in Canada, Probably there's a bit of a history there. I'm sure we could find something about General Brock. I'm sure we could find something about any number of the people who have the statues. Oliver Mowat, name them, and we can find it. Well, we were concerned ourselves, and so we said we want to do something. And so we thought, what can we do? And we thought, well, let's first of all find a vehicle and build a model on what that vehicle might be able to accomplish. And that, I think, is what we've now designed. And so first of all, we decided we'd create a concept of an institute for historical education, to make sure that historical education was correct. That's very, very important. It's not just that, of course. There are other issues. And it's issues of, well, today people have their views or their principles or their mores on what should be appropriate. But how can we apply those to people who existed 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 150 years ago? We can't do that. We can't say, well, 150 years ago, when we talk about MacDonald and whatever he might have said or not said, there were different mores in those days than what exists today. As a matter of fact, they used to hang pickpockets back then, but I don't believe any of us believe today they should hang pickpockets. But back then, people thought that was quite reasonable. Well, our thought is, let's do something about this if we can. We don't know if we can reverse. I mean, maybe the train has left the station on Egerton Ryerson. It's going to be very difficult to get that name ever changed back, but maybe something else can be done. And I know Lynn has some very good ideas on how he can be commemorated, because he should be. We're all products of the public system in Ontario, and we own a bit of Ryerson, just the very fact that we are part of that system, and we were part of it. My wife is here tonight. Her father was a graduate of normal school in education. And my mother, I remember her talking to me about grammar school, and I never knew what it really was. It meant little different things to me than what it did to her when she went to school. So we've got a lot of things we think we can do. We created this institute called the Canadian Institute for Historical Education. And so we probably will find ourselves taking on many, if I can call them, targets, whether it's Ryerson or whether it's MacDonald or whether it's Dundas. We think we can take them on, and we've created an institute with a number of principles that we intend to pursue. What we intend to try to achieve is, using our model, a concept of a colloquium. So we'll have an organization, we'll have members of that association, which we will call associates. They'll pay a membership to join. We will attempt to do, through a process of colloquium, an attempted target. And I have this distinct feeling that if we were to do the big three we've talked about tonight that I've mentioned, MacDonald, and the two that you have been comparing tonight, if we tackled them, at the end of that, we'd have 3 more or 4 more to go. It's just a matter of time before other names start across Canada. You can think of George Cornwallis in Nova Scotia. You can think of all kinds of others across this country for whom there might ultimately be decapping or decapitation or tearing down the street or tearing down the building. These are the things that we're going to do. So we've created an institute. Our model will be along the design of a colloquium and engaging very learned professors. We've heard a couple tonight, Dutille. We've heard about others like Christopher Dummett, Professor Trent, all kinds of individuals who could themselves be called on to give us the real history. We never want to find wrong history leading to the facts that are shown tonight in the Ryerson and in the Dundas situation. We've got to make sure that the evidence is absolutely correct, and we would engage substantial professors to put out the real story. Then we would put out the real story as best we could, and maybe we'll go to the old traditional methods. We might have to get Lynn to write another letter to the editor, but we could go beyond that. We now probably have to look at social media and go to YouTube and go to other means by which to get the messages out to people. 1-minute capsules, that kind of thing. So those are the things that we intend to proceed with. We have an interest in enlarging our number of associates. Today we are about 35, maybe 40 people that constitute our universe of associates. We'll probably increase that to double, and then that will be our critical mass with which we can try and assess the situation. We think we'll probably have to raise money from substantial donors who will help us pay for the research that sometimes will be required. It's relatively easy for us to determine the history of the individual. We can often go to the books, a Richard Gwynne book on MacDonald or whomever it might be. We can go to that history easily enough. But it's the accusations that they stand accused of that we'll have to research and verify with certainty that whatever the case is the case. And we could be talking about Mackenzie King, we could be talking about Wilfrid Laurier, we could be talking about MacDonald. They all had roles in this residential schools that you've been talking about tonight. We're not going to ignore things like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. If you look carefully at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, what's very evident there is that that it states very clearly the only real way to reconciliation is with truth. And that means full truth. They believe that. That was certainly the concept where the TNRC came from, which of course was South Africa. But the concept, the words truth and reconciliation mean you need to have the full truth. Then a reconciliation can happen. That's what we're talking about in many respects, whether it's Ryerson, whether it's Dundas, whether it's MacDonald, whether it's any one of the others that are along coming before too many moons. Bishop Strawn, we can just imagine John Graves Simcoe. We can imagine all kinds of issues there. That's our history, and we own that history. We being all of us in this room, on the online, and in the city. We own that history. That is us. So that's what we're trying to achieve. Lynn asked me to come tonight in the event that some of you might be interested in being part of what we're doing, and she wanted us to be sure to tackle Dundas. And I can report tonight we're tackling Dundas first. So we're going to hold a rather major colloquium in mid-April on Dundas. It'll be a Saturday event, several hours, and we will work over the good and the bad and the whole story. But in the end, we will bring out the full truth as it relates, and then it'll be our job to figure out how to disseminate that in a way that some knucklehead in some other school, some other whatever, will not make the same kind of errors that they made this past time. Can you imagine that? Educational institutions getting wrong history? Isn't there something antithetical about that? There's something wrong about that, totally. That's what we're about. Should any of you be interested in being part of our process, let me know and we would be pleased. I rather think that we are on the same page and we're doing almost the same thing. And if we had 10 more organizations doing this in this city, that would be wonderful. So with that, I'd like to leave you with that and be delighted to talk to you should the occasion present itself. I don't know if there's a question or not, but I'm assuming none, but we'll see if anyone comes forth.
Yeah, I'd be interested in how you're going to structure this colloquium you're talking about, and to what degree are you going to try to include either speakers or people from the educational community. I'm thinking in particular of the Toronto Board of Education. I think I sent you an article that was recently printed in the Globe and Mail about how they are moving ahead in teaching some of the very things that you hope to refute in some ways.
Well,
I mean, in that sense, I guess the train has left the station, so how do you stop it?
well, I think there are many things that should be additionally taught in our education system, but not at the expense of very important things in the past, the history. If you have to do a trade-off, don't do that trade-off. That's wrong. So that would be the argument. But your question was, how do we think we might handle it? Well, first of all, I think we want to make sure that we are not blinded ourselves by our own bias. And we're going to make sure that we have, frankly, both sides of the arguments presented. And in fact, we were playing, one of our loyal members here today is John Parker, a former counselor. I want to assure you that he's not announcing for mayor tonight, but John's a former MPP as well. So he has a lot of history in this area and how councils work. We think that we might even consider something like the Oxford University debates and bring forward, Egerton Ryerson, you stand accused of such and such and such. And what is the argument for that? And what is the argument against it? And so we might even consider that kind of debate concept. And we've been playing with that. But whatever the case is, the intention is to bring out the full story and ultimately the full truth. And then we may have to engage research people to get the full truth out. But then it's our job to figure out how to get that disseminated in a way that authorities, whether they're universities or city councils or any other organization, understand what they can do. You know, right now, Parks Canada have these plaques all across the country commemorating people. I'm told there are 2,900 plaques. Parks Canada have 208 of those plaques under surveillance. I don't mean they're checking them. They're trying to decide whether it was proper, whatever was said on the plaque. And so if you see these purple plaques around, I know there's one on the corner of Mount Pleasant and St. Clair to the three people who were part of that corner, that dedicated that corner to the three ladies that were there. They're reviewing. They're even reviewing the plaque about Samuel D. Champlain. What is there to say about the history of Samuel D. Champlain 500 years ago? There's not much you can add to that picture. But they say, why are we looking at it? Colonization or decolonization. The National Gallery. My wife chaired the board of the National Gallery recently. I think she's glad to be out of there now as they go through their process of so-called decolonization, and they're making some pretty dumb mistakes in the process. So anyway, what will we do? We'll bring out both sides of the argument and then figure how to get the truth on paper and into the public mindset.
Gordon, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Well, I guess we wind up now, and the people who are physically here will have time to talk to each other about these things. And I was fascinated by the allusion to fiction and history because I write historical fiction among other things. And I was supposed to talk to Massey College about the relationship between history and fiction. Thank you very much, everybody. I hope this has been useful and you've enjoyed it. And good night to you all.